that policy. Secondly, think about it. The absence of any sort of policy about protecting children may not be conclusive evidence of negligence, but it is certainly evidence of negligence. You didn't think to address that question. And then third, your sexual misconduct policy may be a critical foundation for considering what is consensual or non-consensual sexual activity by your employees. And here, it's as much an issue of off-duty as on-duty conduct. Now again, it's less of a problem when we're dealing with clergy because we have canonical standards that make that much more difficult to be evasive on. But for non-clergy employees of the diocese or of churches, it may be useful to be able to say, we know the world tells you you can do A, B, and C on your free time. Scripture doesn't tell you that. That's not acceptable. Okay, I'm just going to do a concluding thought about protecting the powerless, and then let's go to pump the panel. We are living at a moment where there is, I think, overall a valuable and a rather belated recognition of the importance of protecting those who are vulnerable. The most obvious category is children. But we're also recognizing that there are some ways in which there are other dynamics that can have an imbalance of power. And so it may be male-female, as in the area of sexual harassment, although sexual harassment can run in both directions. It may be rector staff at a church. It may be clergy laity in some settings. But in all of those instances, you want to be aware of and prepared to address if the imbalance of power in the relationship has caused a problem, what is the right response from the bishop, and you advising the bishop as his chancellor, what's the right response for you to take? Now that may or may not be a legal response. For child abuse or harassment, it is definitely a legal response as well as others. In other areas, it's pastoral, or it's disciplinary, or it's an employer-employee response, but think about it ahead of time. And I'd like to suggest that at this moment in time, our legal system in our world tends to deal with the issues of a power imbalance purely in terms of categories. If you're in category A versus category B, that's the imbalance. I find it more useful to think in terms of a spectrum of power, because often the imbalance is more subtle. Sometimes it runs in the reverse direction, and sometimes thinking of it only in the categorical terms blinds us to the more subtle ways it comes up. But you'll want to just think about that in practice and then say, have we done what we can to protect those who are powerless or less powerful? And of course, the primary example of that would be child protection. I'm going to put up for 30 seconds the elements of a child protection policy that I normally recommend. PowerPoint will be available online with the materials, so don't feel like you have to capture it all. But basically, I normally suggest 5 elements. Screening. Are you screening any worker who will have contact with youth? Supervising. Are you supervising all activities and all workers that involve youth or will have contact with youth? Recognizing. Do you recognize what the signs of child abuse or neglect are? Responding. Wherever there's an allegation of abuse, or often simply indicators of abuse without an allegation. But are you alert to, and are you training people to be able to recognize those indicators? And then finally, reporting. Have you reported abuse as required by applicable laws, which vary from state to state? Let me stop there. I'll catch my breath. We've got, I'm sorry, I ran a little bit long. For those of you who want to stay, let's take a few moments and stump the panel. So for our panelists, if I can ask Jeff Garrity, our Chancellor for the US, Mike Donison, our Chancellor for Canada, and Mose Stewart, we will stand in front of you for you all to throw questions, but the reality is, it's like a firing squad, so we'll all stand up there and hope you don't have bullets. The reality is, all of us are actually the panel. And so we want to encourage your questions just to get you throwing them out our direction. But the reality is, you may know better than any of us how to respond to this particular issue. That's why we're trying to keep cultivating this network of lawyers so we can put our heads together whenever these things come up.
This seems to be a violation of the abuse of panelists policy that I'm sure.
So given the limited time, if you've got a question, please fire. Mark?
Where's the pinpoint, where's this online, the PowerPoint?
The written materials that we've all shared will be online. It'll either be something that the AAC will host or we'll put up a Dropbox for you. But you're giving your email address when you showed up is your key to get into that.
Okay,
What
thank you.
about the other resources that you mentioned, policies and so forth? Where would those be available?
Well, on the child protection policies, those are at diocesan websites. The one I know is just go to Anglican DOMA, DOMA.org, and click on the resources link, and then there'll be child protection resources. There are some other dioceses that have those. I just don't have the reference available on such short notice.
Could we contact you to get those?
You certainly talk with us. And feel free, any of us who participated, come stand in the crew, are happy to be available as a resource. Rich?
Boy, there's a lot of questions on godly admonitions. We're facing that issue in our diocese right now, and you said something that my jaw actually dropped when you said it, because I went right down to your category of abuse. You must turn over all your evidence to me now. It's a godly admonition, and I thought, whoa. And if you don't, I will therefore use that as a weapon to punish you later on. And I thought, wow, that is that power abuse situation. And if I were a rector in that situation, my bishop, and I was the attorney with the rector, I would fight that with all my being, because I don't think that's natural law due process or just. So that was. But and that leads to that question of, let's say I'm the Chancellor for Quincy, who do I represent and how do I take into account this whole idea of protecting my institution at all costs, which is the normal mindset which the Catholic Church in particular, but many other institutions, and us as lawyers have been trained in. Our client is the bishop or the diocese. We protect it at all costs, and now the Catholic Church may dissolve over child abuse as we see the incredible abuse that's taken place. How are we handling that? How do we work through that? Because our natural tendency is always going to be, as you even mentioned when this situation came up, to protect. And so what do we do?
Well, I'll say this, in our situation, that was Neil Barr. One of his godly admonitions was preservation of evidence. That it was an obligation on the accused part, and he gave him a list. You're not going to delete any emails. You're not going to you're going to do this, that, or the other. But preservation of evidence was important. It's just like in secular court, there's an obligation to preserve. You can be dinged for that pretty good too. Spoil evidence. So.
The way that you use it, though, is if the court is ordering it or one thing as opposed to your opponent. So I'm just wrestling with that. And power, bishop versus rector. We had a little discussion last night about a rector's always going to be afraid of a bishop, and it's going to break down some of those communications that we've talked about. So.
Those are all really good questions that I think we do have to grapple with. And part of the reason we're putting all this out for you is to get the conversation going, because we may say, this should be adjusted, or we might say, we're going to propose to the governance task force guidelines for godly admonitions, which wouldn't be compelling because for reasons of subsidiarity, we don't want to be saying to a diocese, you must do it this way, unless it's actually enacted canonically, but it could be a useful guide. One point I would say, I think it's critical to remember that this isn't a court, this is a church process. And so we grapple with the question of how do due process protections apply in something that still is not a civil court proceeding, let alone a criminal court proceeding. And there's some sense, I think, and this is reflected in the beginning of Title IV, there's some sense in which church discipline is holding us to a higher standard, and therefore there may be greater expectations. So I'd humbly submit, if our clergy is spoiling evidence, that is not the sort of behavior that we would expect of our clergy. That suggests there is something being hidden. And so for that reason, if the clergy is saying, I'm not going to tell you if I'm doing this, I'm not going to let you look at my computer, that is an issue for their spiritual oversight to be concerned about. Now, there may be a process that goes on between the clergy and the bishop, or between their council and the chancellor, saying, we need some protections, we need some guardrails, we need some procedural rules. But it's a discussion that's going on in a setting that is not your stereotypical civil legal setting. Jeff, Mike, did you have thoughts to?
Well, I would just say in some of the canons, some dioceses have established certain specific rules of procedure and evidence that are the same as the state courts. They've adopted them. And so if it's there, then I think spoliation of evidence would be a matter of great concern to the trial court. And you know, there may be a lot of adverse inferences against that accused. In the civil court, even in the civil courts, particularly in the area of trucking litigation, the first thing we do when we see the case is immediately send a don't spoil